My mother admitted she never wanted me, and my father said I was ruining their lives. When I finally ran away, I discovered a terrible truth. I guess it all started the day I was born, or maybe even before that. Growing up, I always felt like I was the odd one out, the mistake that everyone wished never happened. My parents, Mary and Greg, were young, barely out of high school, and according to the whispers I overheard, I was never part of their plan. They got married because of me, and it didn't take long for them to resent it. I don't have many memories of being held or cuddled as a child. In fact, I barely remember any affection at all. My earliest memories are mostly of my mother's cold stares and my father's constant absence. He was a truck driver, always on the road, and I often wondered if he took extra routes just to stay away from home. When he was around, he treated me like a burden, something that had ruined his life. He would often lose his temper, throwing things across the room, yelling at my mother, blaming her for being too stupid to use protection. I was a ghost in my own house, only noticed when they needed someone to blame for their misery. In school, from the very beginning, it felt like the teachers were in on the secret, like they knew I was unwanted and treated me accordingly. Mrs. Thompson, my first grade teacher, was the worst. She had this way of making me feel like I was the dumbest kid in the room. No matter how hard I tried, my efforts were never enough. I was always the last to be called on, and when I was, she would roll her eyes, sigh, and make some snide comment about how slow I was. The other kids picked up on it quickly. They saw how she treated me and followed her lead, making me the target of their jokes and bullying. By the time I was in third grade, I was the class pariah. The other kids called me mistake behind my back, but sometimes right to my face. They'd knock my books out of my hands, trip me in the hallways, and spread rumors about how my parents hated me. I remember one time during recess, a group of boys led by Tyler, the class bully, cornered me behind the school. Tyler was a big kid, bigger than most of the others, and he had a mean streak that ran deep. He pushed me against the brick wall, his breath hot and rancid on my face, and told me that I should just disappear. That nobody would care if I did, and then they did something that still haunts me to this day. Tyler pulled out a lighter he had stolen from his older brother and flicked it on, the small flame dancing dangerously close to my face. I was terrified, frozen in place, but I managed to beg them to stop. Tyler just laughed, and then, in a moment that seemed to stretch on forever, he held the flame to my arm. The pain was instant, searing through my skin, and I screamed. The boys scattered, laughing as they ran, leaving me there with a small painful burn that I knew I couldn't tell anyone about. When I got home, I lied and told my mother I had accidentally touched the stove. She barely looked up from her magazine. The years went by, and the hatred from my classmates only grew. By middle school, the bullying had escalated to a point where I dreaded going to school every day. The teachers continued to ignore me, or worse, they joined in the ridicule. Mr. Davis, my math teacher, had a special dislike for me. He would purposely call on me to solve the hardest problems, knowing I would get them wrong. When I did, he would make a show of it, laughing and saying things like, "Well, I guess not everyone is cut out for math." The class would erupt in laughter, and I would sit there, trying to disappear into my seat. But the worst was yet to come. There was one event that truly broke me, something that made me question whether I could keep going. It was the last day of 8th grade, and we were supposed to have a fun day. No classes, just games and activities to celebrate the end of the school year. I was hoping to just blend in, stay out of sight, and make it through the day without incident. But of course, Tyler had other plans. During one of the activities, a water balloon fight, Tyler and his gang decided to target me specifically. At first, it was just water balloons, but then they started filling them with other things, mud, paint, anything they could find. By the time they were done, I was covered in filth, and they were howling with laughter. I ran to the bathroom to clean up, humiliated and on the verge of tears, but it didn't end there. Later that day, as we were all leaving school, Tyler and his friends caught up with me again. This time, they were carrying backpacks stuffed with God knows what. They dragged me behind the school, where no one could see, and started pulling out the contents of their bags, rotten eggs, spoiled milk, and other disgusting things they had been saving for this very moment. They threw everything at me, laughing as I gagged and tried to shield myself. I remember the smell, the overwhelming stench that made me want to vomit. But the worst part was when Tyler pulled out a pair of scissors. At first, I didn't understand what he was planning. He grabbed me by the hair, yanking my head back, and then I realized with horror what he was about to do. He started cutting chunks of my hair off, uneven and jagged, laughing the whole time. I tried to fight back, but his friends held me down. By the time they were done, I was left with a patchy, humiliating mess on my head. They threw the clumps of my hair in my face and ran off, leaving me there in tears. When I got home, my mother took one look at me and sighed. "What did you do now?" she asked, as if this was somehow my fault. I didn't even try to explain. I just went to my room, locked the door, and cried myself to sleep. High school wasn't any better. The bullying continued, though it became more psychological than physical. My parents' neglect became even more apparent as they grew colder and more distant. They had 2 more kids by then, my younger siblings, who were the apple of their eyes. I was the mistake, the accident they had to tolerate. But my brother and sister were their pride and joy. They got everything I never had: love, attention, support. It was like I didn't exist anymore, like I was just a ghost haunting the house. One night, after another particularly brutal day at school, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. My father was drunk, slurring his words, and my mother was trying to keep him quiet. But I heard everything. "I wish we never had him," my father said, his voice filled with bitterness. "Our lives would have been so much better without that damn mistake." My mother didn't argue, she just sighed and said, "It is what it is, Greg. We're stuck with him." Those words cut deeper than anything else. I was stuck with them, but they were stuck with me too, and it was clear they resented every second of it. I felt like I was drowning, like I was trapped in a life that I couldn't escape from. The thought of ending it all crossed my mind more times than I can count, but something always held me back. Maybe it was the small, desperate hope that things might get better, that someone might finally see me and care. But as the years went by, that hope dwindled. The abuse, the neglect, the constant feeling of being unwanted, it all became too much. I started skipping school, spending most of my days wandering around town, trying to avoid going home. When I did go home, I would lock myself in my room, staying up all night just to avoid seeing my parents. On Saturday, and my parents had gone out for the evening, leaving me to watch my younger siblings, I didn't mind. They were the only ones who didn't treat me like a burden. We were watching a movie when the phone rang. I answered it, and it was one of my father's drinking buddies, calling to say that my parents had been in a car accident. They were both in the hospital, and it didn't look good. When I hung up, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was fear, of course, and sadness, but there was also something else, something I didn't want to admit to myself. A small dark part of me felt relief that maybe, just maybe, I could finally be free from the people who had made my life a living hell. But that relief was short-lived. My parents survived the accident, though they were both seriously injured. When they came home from the hospital, things got even worse. My father became even more bitter and angry, taking his frustrations out on me more than ever. My mother, now dealing with chronic pain, became completely withdrawn, leaving me to take care of my siblings on my own. It was during this time that I started to lose myself. The constant stress, the never-ending cycle of abuse and neglect, it all started to wear me down. I stopped caring about school, about my future, about anything really. I was just trying to survive each day, hoping that somehow things would change. The decision to run away wasn't something I took lightly. After that night when my parents were in the car accident, something inside me shifted. I realized that if I stayed, I would never escape the cycle of misery that had defined my life for as long as I could remember. I was suffocating in that house, in that town, in the life that had been forced upon me. I needed to get out, to breathe, to find a way to live that didn't involve constant pain and neglect. I spent months planning my escape. I saved up every bit of money I could get from odd jobs, sneaking away whatever cash I could find. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get me started. The hardest part was figuring out where to go. I wanted to go somewhere far away, somewhere where no one knew me, where I could start fresh. After some research, I decided on a city several states away, large enough to get lost in, but with opportunities for someone willing to work hard. It was perfect. The night I left, I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I waited until everyone was asleep, packed my few belongings into a backpack, and slipped out the front door. I remember standing on the front porch for a moment, looking back at the house, wondering if I would ever see it again, but there was no love lost there, no reason to stay, so I turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. I took a bus as far as my money would take me, and then another, until I finally arrived in the city that would become my new home. I had no friends, no family, and only a few dollars left in my pocket, but for the first time in my life, I felt free. The city was overwhelming at first, so many people, so much noise, but it was also exhilarating. I could be anyone I wanted to be here. No one knew about my past, my family, or the things that had been done to me. I was a blank slate, and the possibilities seemed endless. The first few weeks were tough. I slept in shelters or sometimes on the streets while I searched for a job. I was determined not to go back no matter how hard things got. I spent my days going from place to place, filling out applications, willing to do anything just to get a foothold. Finally, I got a break. A small diner on the edge of town was looking for a dishwasher. It wasn't much, but it was something, and it was enough to get me off the streets. The work was hard, and the pay was barely enough to cover my rent in the tiny room I found, but I didn't care. I was working, I was earning my own money, and I was free from the hell I had escaped. I kept my head down, did my job, and slowly, things started to get better. I moved up from washing dishes to bussing tables, and then to waiting tables. I was good at it, better than I had expected, and the tips were decent. I started to save up again, this time with a new goal in mind, to make something of myself. To prove to everyone, especially my parents, that I was more than the mistake they had always called me. As the months went by, I became more comfortable in the city. I made a few friends, other people who had their own stories of running away or starting over. We bonded over our shared experiences, and for the first time I started to feel like I belonged somewhere. I wasn't alone anymore, and that gave me the strength to keep pushing forward. My big break came when I was offered a job at a new restaurant that was opening downtown. It was a step up from the diner, a nicer place, with better pay and more opportunities for advancement. I jumped at the chance and worked harder than ever to prove myself. The owner, a sharp but fair woman named Lisa, saw potential in me and took me under her wing. She taught me everything she knew about the restaurant business, and I soaked it all up, eager to learn. Under Lisa's guidance, my career began to take off. I moved from waiting tables to managing the front of the house, and then to overseeing the entire restaurant. I was making good money, enough to afford a decent apartment, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control of my future. The restaurant became my life, my passion, and I poured everything I had into making it a success, and it was working. But even as things were going well for me, I couldn't completely shake the shadows of my past. I would sometimes wonder about my family, about what had happened to them after I left. I knew I shouldn't care. They had never cared about me, but some part of me couldn't let go. I didn't contact them, but I occasionally asked mutual acquaintances about them, just to know they were still alive. It was during one of these inquiries that I learned things had taken a turn for the worse back home. My father, who had never been able to hold down a job after the accident, had become even more bitter and angry. My mother, who had always been passive, had fallen into a deep depression, leaving my younger siblings to fend for themselves. They were struggling, barely making ends meet, and from what I heard, the house had fallen into disrepair. Hearing this filled me with a mix of emotions: relief that I'd escaped, guilt for leaving them behind, and a strange sense of satisfaction that they were finally facing the consequences of their actions. But I pushed those feelings aside, focusing on my own life, my own success. I had worked too hard to let the past drag me down. Then, out of nowhere, I got a call from my father. I hadn't heard his voice in years, and the sound of it sent a chill down my spine. He didn't ask how I was, didn't apologize for anything. He just told me that they were struggling, that they needed money, and that it was time I man up and helped out. I couldn't a while believe his audacity. After everything he had done to me, after all the pain and neglect, he had the nerve to ask for my help. But what shocked me the most was the rage I felt bubbling up inside me. I had thought I was over it, that I had moved on. But hearing his voice, hearing him demand something from me as if I owed him, brought all those old wounds rushing back. I told him no, that I didn't owe him anything, and that if he was in trouble, it was his own fault. That's when he snapped. He started screaming at me, calling me ungrateful, selfish, a failure. He blamed me for everything, for their financial problems, for my mother's depression, for his own failures. He accused me of abandoning the family, of leaving them to suffer while I lived it up in the city. His words were venomous, filled with the same hatred I had grown up with. And it was like being a kid all over again, trapped and helpless. But I wasn't a kid anymore. I was an adult, and I had a life of my own. I told him to go to hell, that I was done with him, with all of them. I hung up the phone, shaking with anger. A few days later, my father showed up at my apartment. I don't know how he found me, but there he was, pounding on my door, demanding that I let him in. I refused, but he wouldn't leave. He kept yelling, threatening to break down the door if I didn't open it. I was terrified of what he might do, of what he might say. But I couldn't let him in. I couldn't let him drag me back into that world. Eventually, I opened the door, hoping to calm him down, to get him to leave. But as soon as he saw me, the rage in his eyes told me there was no reasoning with him. He lunged at me, fist swinging, and we started fighting right there in the doorway. He was bigger and stronger than me, and for a moment I thought he might actually kill me. But then something inside me snapped, and I fought back with everything I had. I pushed him away, hitting him as hard as I could, and finally he staggered back, breathing heavily, blood running down his face. I stood there panting, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and in that moment I realized just how much I hated him. I hated him for everything he had done to me, for the way he had treated me, for the way he had tried to ruin my life. And I hated him even more for coming here, for trying to drag me back down after I had finally managed to pull myself up. He looked at me, eyes filled with a mix of anger and disbelief, and for a moment I thought he might try to attack me again. But then he just turned and walked away, leaving me standing there in the doorway, shaking with rage and fear. I didn't hear from him again for a while. I tried to put the whole thing behind me, to focus on my work, on the life I had built. But it wasn't easy. The fight had stirred up all the old wounds, and I found myself struggling to move past it. I started drinking more, trying to numb the pain, but it only made things worse. My work began to suffer, and for the first time since I had left home, I felt like I was losing control. Then one day I got a call from a hospital back home. My father had been in a truck accident, another one, but this time it was serious. He was in critical condition, and they didn't know if he would make it. They asked if I could come, if I could be there for him. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to go, to see him, to confront him one last time. But another part of me wanted nothing to do with him. He had caused me so much pain, so much suffering, and I wasn't sure if I could face him again. In the end, I decided not to go. I told myself that it was his own fault, that he had brought this on himself, and that I had no obligation to him. A few days later, I got another call. My father had died. The truck accident had been bad, really bad, and he made it. The hospital asked if I wanted to arrange the funeral, but I refused. I told them to contact my mother, to let her deal with it. I couldn't bring myself to care, but that wasn't entirely true. I did care, in a way. I cared because his death meant that chapter of my life was finally, truly, over. There was no going back now. No more chances for him to hurt me. No more lingering threat hanging over my head. For the first time in my life I was completely free, and that freedom was a heavy, terrifying thing. I didn't go to the funeral. I didn't even ask when it was. I stayed in the city, throwing myself into my work, trying to forget everything that had happened. But the memories were still there, lurking in the back of my mind, haunting my dreams. I knew I needed to deal with them, to find some way to move past it all, but I didn't know how. It took months for me to start feeling like myself again. I cut back on the drinking, started going to therapy, and slowly I began to heal. I realized that I wasn't just grieving for my father. I was grieving for the childhood I never had, for the family that never was, for all the things I had lost along the way. But as the months turned into years, I found a way to move forward. I continued to work hard to build the life I had always wanted, and eventually I found a sense of peace. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the memories would come flooding back, but I had learned to live with them. I had learned that the past didn't define me, that I could choose my own path, that I could be more than the mistake my parents had always seen me as. After years of hard work, countless hours, and endless determination, I finally reached a point where I could make my dream a reality. I had saved up enough money, built a network of industry contacts, and learned the ins and outs of the restaurant business. It was time to open my own restaurant, a place that would be mine, a symbol of everything I had overcome and achieved. I found the perfect location in a bustling part of the city, an old building with character and charm that needed a lot of work, but had enormous potential. It was a daunting task, renovating and designing the space from the ground up, but I was driven by a vision. I wanted a place that felt welcoming, warm, and full of life, a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive environment I had grown up in. The renovation process was intense. I worked closely with a designer, an energetic woman named Olivia, who understood my vision perfectly. We spent hours poring over every detail, from the color scheme to the layout of the tables, the lighting, and even the artwork on the walls. I wanted the restaurant to reflect my journey, my resilience, and my love for food. Olivia helped me bring that vision to life, and slowly, the empty shell of a building began to transform into something beautiful. Opening day was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. I'd invited friends, industry colleagues, and a few local food critics, hoping to make a strong impression. The night before the opening, I barely slept, going over every last detail in my mind, terrified that something would go wrong. But when the day finally arrived, and I saw the restaurant full of people, enjoying the food, the atmosphere, and the experience I'd created, I knew it had all been worth it. The first few weeks were of activity. The restaurant was busier than I had expected, and the positive reviews started pouring in. People loved the food, the ambience, and the story behind the restaurant. It quickly became a popular spot in the city, and for the first time I felt a sense of pride and accomplishment that I had never known before. I had built something from nothing, something that was entirely my own, and it was thriving. One evening, as I was finishing up at the restaurant after another successful day, I received a call from an unknown number. It was my mother, her voice shaky and desperate. She told me that she was struggling, that she couldn't make ends meet, and that she needed my money to survive. For a moment, I was taken aback. It had been years since I had heard from her, and I had hoped that I was finally free of her and the toxicity she had brought into my life. But here she was, reaching out to me, not to apologize or make amends, but to ask for money. I felt the old anger rising up inside me, the resentment and bitterness that I had worked so hard to leave behind. I told her no. I told her that I had nothing to give her, that after everything she and my father had put me through, I didn't owe her anything. But she didn't take it well. She started crying, screaming at me over the phone, telling me that I was heartless, that I was abandoning her just like I had abandoned the rest of the family. She threatened to kill herself if I didn't help her. It was a moment of utter disbelief. I had always known my mother to be manipulative, but this was something else entirely. The thought of her actually going through with it was horrifying, but at the same time I couldn't let her control me with threats. I told her that she needed help, real help, and that I wasn't going to be manipulated by her anymore. A few days later, she showed up at the restaurant. I was in the middle of a busy lunch service when one of the servers came to tell me that a woman was waiting for me at the bar. She looked different, older, more worn down, and there was a wild, almost crazed look in her eyes. I didn't want to cause a scene in front of the customers, so I led her to a private office at the back of the restaurant. As soon as the door closed behind us, she started in on me again, begging for money, saying that she was desperate, that she had nowhere else to turn. She told me that I wasn't her son. At first I thought I had misheard her, but she repeated it, her voice shaking with emotion. She said that I wasn't her biological child, that she had taken me in when I was a baby, and that she had kept it a secret all these years. She said that she had always resented me because I wasn't really hers, that she had never wanted me, but had been forced to raise me because of a promise she made to someone. I stood there stunned, trying to process what she was saying. It didn't make any sense. How could I not be her son, and if I wasn't he, then who was I? I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, like everything I thought I knew about myself was a lie. But as the shock began to wear off, I realized that I needed answers. I needed to know the truth, to find out where I came from, and why she had kept this secret from me for so long. I demanded that she tell me everything, but she just started crying again, saying that she couldn't that it was too complicated, too painful. I was going to find out the truth, no matter what it took. The first thing I did was hire a private investigator, a serious woman named Karen, who had a reputation for getting results. I told her everything, every detail I could remember from what my mother had said, and asked her to dig into my past, to find out who I really was. Karen was thorough. She started by looking into my birth records, but it quickly became clear that things weren't adding up. The records showed that I had been born in a hospital, in a small town, not far from where I grew up. But there were discrepancies, missing documents, strange notations, and a lack of any clear evidence that my mother had actually given birth to me. Karen then turned her attention to the people who might know something: old neighbors, family friends, anyone who might have been around when I was born. What she found was disturbing. Several people remembered that my parents had suddenly adopted me when I was a baby, but none of them seemed to know where I had come from. There were rumors, whispers about a deal my mother had made with someone, but nothing concrete. It was all hearsay, speculation, and dead ends. But Karen didn't give up. She kept digging, looking for anything that might give us a clue, and then, after weeks of searching, she found something in name. A woman named Sarah, who had lived in the same town around the time I was born, and who had mysteriously disappeared shortly after. Karen tracked down some old records, including a police report that mentioned Sarah's name. According to the report, Sarah had been involved in a domestic dispute with a man who was suspected of abusing her. The report mentioned that Sarah had recently given birth, but the baby was never found. It was a lead, the first real one we had, and it was enough to convince me that I needed to take this to the next level. I decided to file a lawsuit against my mother, demanding a paternity test and an investigation into my true origins. I wanted to know the truth, and I wanted to make sure that she couldn't hurt me anymore. The court process was grueling. My mother fought back, hiring a lawyer who tried to paint me as ungrateful, unstable, and vindictive. They tried to argue that the lawsuit was a desperate attempt to hurt her, to punish her for mistakes she had made in the past. But I knew it was more than that. It was about finding the truth, about taking control of my own life. The court ordered a paternity test, and the results were clear: I was not my mother's biological child. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom, and I could see the look of shock and betrayal on my mother's face as the truth was laid bare. But for me, it was a moment of clarity, of validation. I wasn't the mistake she had always called me. I was someone else, someone with a different story, a different past. But the questions didn't end there. The court also ordered an investigation into my origins, and what they found was even more shocking than I had imagined. The woman named Sarah, who Karen had discovered, was indeed my biological mother. She had been a young woman, scared and alone, fleeing an abusive relationship. She had given birth to me in secret, and shortly after, she had been killed in a tragic accident. My mother Mary had taken me in, not out of kindness or love, but as part of a deal with the man who had been abusing Sarah. The man, it turned out, was my biological father, a violent, dangerous man who had used my mother to cover up his crimes. He had paid her to take me, to raise me as her own, to keep the truth hidden. And she had done it, living with the guilt and the resentment every day, taking it out on me because she couldn't take it out on him. The court case dragged on for months, with my mother fighting every step of the way. But in the end, the truth came out. The court ruled in my favor, severing all legal ties between us. I was free, free from her, free from the lies, free from the past that had haunted me for so long. I continued to focus on the restaurant, pouring my energy into making it the best it could be. I found solace in my work, in the people who supported me, in the life I had built for myself. I started therapy again, working through the trauma, the anger, and the grief. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the past felt like a heavy weight on my shoulders. But I was determined to move forward. As time went on, I started to find a sense of peace. I reconnected with some of the friends I had made in the city, the ones who had become like a family to me. I started to build new relationships, to trust people again, to let them into my life. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. I'd spent so many years alone, trapped in a world of pain and loneliness, but now I was finally starting to open up, to let others in, to find joy and connection in the world around me. And as I stood in the restaurant one evening, looking out at the bustling dining room, filled with people laughing, talking, and enjoying the food and atmosphere I had created, I realized that I'd finally found what I'd been searching for all along: a place where I belong. A life that was mine, free from the shadows of the past,